Hey there, Fiber Junkies! Welcome back to the Color Cauldron. I'm Johanna, the owner and dyer behind Potion Yarns and host of this podcast. Today we are doing one of my very favorite segments that we do once a month, Saturday Night at the Movies. This is my favorite because I love films, especially old movies, and I love bringing you something a little bit different that we do on this podcast that I haven't seen other knitting podcasts do, that kind of combines a film every month that features some type of fiber arts. So knitting, crochet, spinning, sometimes it's literally just like vaguely having to do with wool or sheep, and usually it's just a simple little scene or a character knitting or spinning or winding yarn in the background of a scene or an offhand remark, but other times it features prominently in the plot. So each month we feature a different film that has something to do with wool or yarn or the fiber arts of some kind, even if it's just sewing or embroidering or whatever. And then we also talk about the plot of the film a little bit, give a quick movie review. We talk about some of the cool things that go on with the behind the scenes of the film, interesting tidbits or facts, and then we pair a pattern with the film. Sometimes these are period appropriate pieces, like back in January we did The Women from 1939, and we chose an authentic 1930s, early 40s little hat pattern that we knit up. So sometimes they're authentic from that time period, other times they're just reminiscent of the time period, perhaps a modern pattern that was designed in a vintage style to look like the 50s or the 40s or whatever. Other times they don't have any direct relation to the time period of the film, but they have something to do with the film. Perhaps it's something that was mentioned in the movie, perhaps it's just something that, a piece that really brings some of the themes of the movie in, or that has the same emotional kind of connection. They always have some sort of connection to the film, but they may not be authentic to that time period. So I'm so excited for May's Saturday Night at the Movies because it's one of my personal favorite films that I grew up watching from the time I was a little kid. Like, I don't remember a time that this movie wasn't part of my life. It was one of my absolute favorites growing up, and I recently rewatched it again, and it had been a couple years since I'd seen it, so it was really fun to get back into it and remember my favorite characters and scenes and just kind of connect with that part of my childhood. And as we are going this year, I do yarn clubs in my shop, and so every month there's an exclusive limited edition colorway that is based around a theme. And this year's theme for 2019 is Stars of the Silver Screen. So actors and actresses from the 1920s to the 1960s. Now there is only one a month that we feature, which is unfortunate because there is no way we're going to get to all of the amazing stars and actors and actresses out there from that time period. We're only going to get to do 12, but we're picking some of my favorites and just going with them. And each month there's a new exclusive limited edition colorway you can order. I will drop a link to this month's below because it's only open until the 15th, so you only have a few more days to get it. And then we also have so far managed to pair our star of the month is always featured in the film that we're doing for Saturday Night at the Movies. So we've done great stars like Cary Grant, Doris Day, Rosalind Russell, Fred Astaire. This month, for May, we have another male actor, and his name is Errol Flynn. Who out there is an Errol Flynn fan? Me, for sure. We're not going to talk much about his private life on this. We're just going to stick to his career. His private life was nothing to write home about. Didn't sound like he actually had a very great one. But his acting ability was very great, really, really cool. He did a lot of great films, and he was really known for his very bold, daring, masculine kind of style. He tended to be featured in films that were very adventuresome. Swashbuckling is one of the best words I came up with for him because he was in a lot of films that take place on the sea, a lot of pirate and soldier films. He also did a stint in the 40s through a bunch of westerns. So he was always kind of that like manly man, the sailor, the soldier, the mutineer, the pirate, the cowboy. He often had those kinds of roles. He did do some authentic period pieces where he played a specific person from history to varying success, and he also did a lot of fictional accounts as well. And he did several films that were movie adaptations of books by one of my personal favorite authors, Raphael Sabatini. He wrote things like Captain Blood, which Errol Flynn was in, The Seahawk, which Errol Flynn was in, and Scaramouche, which Errol Flynn was not in, but is an amazing book and was a film with Stuart Granger. So, yeah, he kind of had that, like, daring, adventurous, kind of reckless, very action-oriented, but most of his films were filmed in the 1930s and 40s, and so the action films of the 1930s look very, very different than the action films of today. They still had fight scenes and quick camera angles, but not nearly the same kind of a thing today. Way less gore, not quite as quickly moving cameras, things like that. But they're still really fun and enjoyable, and the best part is they are generally very clean, so there's something you can watch with your whole family. You don't have to worry about little kids hearing bad language or seeing any nudity or anything like that. In the early 1930s and up through the early 1960s, Hollywood was governed by a strict thing called a production code. Basically, it was a morality police for the film industry. So the Catholic Church was really instrumental in setting this up, and the idea was at the time, film was growing rapidly, and it was kind of a new medium. Like, they'd had some films started in the late 1800s, but, you know, it was like a couple minutes long for a movie, and it was silent, and it was just very, very experimental and different. And by the 1930s, it was really taking off, and the Hollywood industry was, like, booming and growing rapidly. And a lot of people in the public were very concerned about keeping the entertainment industry clean and family-friendly because of the incredible influence that film was having on people's lives. And in the 1920s, if you go back and watch old movies from the teens and 20s, sometimes you'll be shocked to see some of the things that they put on camera back then before they had a production code. Or if you watch foreign films, like a lot of European films in the early 1930s had nudity in them quite frequently and calmly, just, you know, oh, it's just there, like, it's normal. And for someone who grew up watching old movies but post-production code, I was shocked the first time I saw a couple early films and was like, oh my gosh, like, there's just, I didn't know they had nudity in the 20s on film. But by the 1930s, they had started this pretty strict production code, so there was no nudity, there was no, I mean, even things like if you showed a married couple talking in their bedroom, they weren't allowed to be in the same bed unless one of them had their feet on the ground. So, like, they could sit on the edge of the bed and talk to each other, but you couldn't show a scene with, like, a husband and wife with his arm around his wife. Even if it was clear that they're married and they're not doing anything sexual in the shot, you couldn't even do that with the production code. Absolutely no foul language, absolutely no, you had to be very creative with the way you cut things to insinuate, oh, they're gonna go have sex, because you couldn't show anything. Like, it was very, very strict. So the good side to all of that, there are actually probably several good sides, but one of the good sides my family enjoyed when I was growing up is I got to watch a lot of movies with my parents as a little kid, like the one that we're going to do today, because it didn't really have anything other than maybe a little violence, and the violence is so minuscule compared to what we do today. And like the film we're going to have today is an adventure film, and there's fighting scenes and people getting stabbed, and you only see a tiny bit of very, very fakey blood, and it's all in black and white. But most of the time, like, someone gets shot and they just kind of like go rigid and then keel over, and there's no blood or anything. So it's pretty tame on the violence, and relatively a small portion of the story. So let's get into talking about our film today. I was really, really torn because Errol Flynn did a ton of great films that I really wanted to highlight, and several of his films have very, very brief glimpses of some sort of fiber arts or fiber crafting with hands, like sewing or something, in snippets of the film. So it was really hard picking one, but I ended up going with my personal favorite Errol Flynn film, which is The Seahawk from 1940. The Seahawk is an amazing, amazing film. It's based on a true story, kind of loosely. So it's actually a fictionalized story, but it's taking place in an actual historical time period with real historical figures like Queen Elizabeth and things like that. And it involves kind of a imaginative and fictionalized version of events, but it helps you understand a little bit more about a time period that, as a relatively young person in America, I only kind of glossed over in history class and didn't know that much about. So the time period is during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. If you're having a hard time remembering, especially because I know that us in the States, we sometimes get all of those kings and queens of England confused sometimes. Queen Elizabeth was Henry VIII's daughter, one of his daughters. So after Henry VIII, the guy with all the wives, and he kept killing them off, right? His first daughter, Mary, took the throne for a little bit. That was not a great rip-roaring success. She didn't last long. And then his second daughter, Elizabeth, from a different wife, took over. And she was actually quite a success as a queen, regardless of how you feel about her personally. I personally think that what I've read about her is like all real people in real life. She's not really black or white. She's not really good or evil. She did some amazingly, really great things for England and for her people. And I think she stabilized the country a lot after the chaos of Henry and Mary's reign. But, she wasn't perfect. She had definitely some not great things that happened during her reign as well. But in this film, she's definitely more of like a positive character. And so Queen Elizabeth I is reigning England. Philip of Spain is reigning in Spain. And there's kind of this awkward relationship back and forth with them at the time period where sometimes they're getting along and working together, but there's always this underlying threat. And we come into this film with this idea that Philip is building an armada on the seas, and he's kind of gearing up to what looks like he's gearing up to attack England. So Elizabeth and her counselors are getting really nervous that he's gathering all this power and he's getting all these ships and all this money, and they're feeling this threat growing from Spain trying to take over the world. And Philip has continued to take over more and more of the world. Both Spain and England have settlements in the New World, in the Americas, and they're jockeying for more and more position over there. They've got other colonies throughout like Asia and places like that in Europe. So there's very much this grab for power going on. And in the beginning of this film, we meet Geoffrey Thorpe, who is Errol Flynn's character. He is a privateer, which means he's not like in the Navy. He's just, he's got his own ship, and he's like running a business for himself basically with his ship. But he's kind of got this weird thing going on. Technically, he's a privateer, but he is very loyal to Elizabeth and the throne of England, and he works in her best interest. So basically, Elizabeth likes that he is working in her interest, but she can't officially condone what he's doing without political drama erupting. Because what he's doing is actually, he's basically a pirate, but he only attacks Spanish ships. So he's like protecting England, and he'll attack Spanish ships, take their gold, sink their ships so that he's weakening their power. He's taking their riches and jewels back to England to enrich England. So he's helping the Queen, but he's not exactly doing it legally or fairly. I mean, he's a criminal, but the Queen kind of looks the other way because it's helping him. But she's not officially condoning it, right? So that's kind of the situation that's happening. In the beginning of the film, Geoffrey Thorpe's ship overtakes a Spanish ship that is bringing the Spanish ambassador, played by Claude Rains, one of my favorite old actors. And he is coming to England. And Errol Flynn's character falls in love with the ambassador's niece, Donna Maria, who's played by the absolutely gorgeous and sweet Brenda Marshall. She was not a very big star. She only played in a couple films that I'm aware of, but she's absolutely gorgeous. She's a great actress. Her other, probably most famous role was in The Lady Vanishes, which is an Alfred Hitchcock film. I highly recommend you go check that one out because it's really amazing. But she does a great job as Donna Maria in here. And Donna Maria is kind of this like feisty little character in the beginning. Captain Thorpe sinks her ship and takes her onto his ship to go back to England. And so she's does the outwardly protesting, looking down her nose at him, calling him a pirate and a thief, and being very snobby and I'm too good for you. And she's really angry at him and all this stuff. But she weakens as she gets to know him, of course, because he's Errol Flynn. He's dashing and charming, and he's a gentleman, and he returns her jewels and won't steal her personal jewels from her and all these things. And so, of course, she falls for him. Like, who wouldn't, right? He's pretty sexy in this film. So she falls for him, but she can't bring herself to tell him yet. And he's really bad at talking to women, so he gets all like flustered and can't talk to her. And so they're trying to like tell each other their feelings, but they can't get it out. In the meantime, he undertakes a dangerous mission to the Americas for Queen Elizabeth. Again, unofficially. He's going to unofficially thwart the Spanish's attempts to attack England and take over more territory, etc. And so he goes to the New World, to try and steal some gold and riches from the Spanish. He ends up getting caught, and he has to work in the galley of a ship. And so it looks like he's never going to see England and Donna Maria again, and all of these things. So I won't spoil it for you. I won't tell you what happens after that. There's a whole bunch of switches on switches and hijinks on the high seas and on land. There's just a lot going on in this film. It's got some absolutely great actors and actresses in it. As I mentioned, Claude Rains is one of the supporting characters. Henry Daniell is Lord Wolfingham, who's one of the antagonists, one of the bad guys. He does a pretty great job. My personal favorite character in this entire film, which is hard to pick because there's so many good ones, is Queen Elizabeth. The actress who plays her, Flora Robson, is just amazing. She actually played Queen Elizabeth in more than one film, and you can see why they hired her for the Seahawk. She'd already played Queen Elizabeth in a film about 3 years before this, and called Fire Over England. And you can definitely see in this movie why they picked her again, because she's just the incomparable Elizabeth. I seriously, every time I think of Queen Elizabeth, when I'm like reading a history book or I hear about it or her or something, I picture this gal in this movie because she's so perfectly embodies what I imagine Elizabeth to be like. Now, of course, we have no idea, but we do know that Elizabeth was a total badass. She was like, she was a queen raised in the era where that was a queen who was unmarried was basically unheard of. But she was called the Virgin Queen because she never married. She never had like a prince consort or anyone like that. We do believe that she had some lovers. There's some evidence that she took some lovers occasionally on the side, but none of them were very long lasting, and she didn't really do a lot. And there is some debate about whether or not she actually ever slept with any of them, or if she just had like some flirtations with some. I don't know much about that, so I'm not going to speculate, but obviously she was pretty amazing because she was a very, very strong, firm woman. She ruled by herself. She refused her counselor's advice to get married and take a husband, and because then he would get to rule, basically. She had the birthright. She was the queen. If she took a husband, he would basically get all of that, and she would kind of be, she would be a co-ruler, but not really at that time period. So she resisted that and did it herself, and was actually a way better ruler than many of the previous kings. So she was pretty awesome. She's so I don't know how to say it other than just she's a badass. She's really, really firm and harsh, and she holds her own, and she puts these men in their place. But then she's also, there's a couple scenes I love where she's like basically yelling at these men and like laying down the law, and then she'll switch suddenly and be like, thank you, that's all, and like flutter her eyelashes at them, and I'm like, go girl, you go. Be like a badass holding your own against these men, but then bringing in your feminine wiles and being all like charming and sweet. It's so great. I love how she mixes that. So I don't know if that's really how the real Elizabeth was, but I love this rendition of her. I think she's really great. Although I guess I misspoke when I said she was my very favorite character, because there is one other character I love just as much, if not more, although it's a bit part, so we don't get to see this character nearly as much as I would like. And that is the monkey! Of course, being the animal lover that I am, I love the monkey best. But who wouldn't? It's a Capuchin monkey, and he is just so stinking cute. He tips his hat to the queen, and he gets into hijinks in her palace. He's a gift from Captain Thorpe to Queen Elizabeth, and he's only in there briefly towards the beginning, which is a major shame because he's the best part of the movie. But he's adorable and hilarious, and I just love him. And when I was a little kid, that was definitely why I watched this movie with my dad, was for the monkey. Also, there's a great bit character played by an amazing character actress of the time, Una O'Connor, and she plays the lady in waiting to Donna Maria. She's just a feisty, funny little older gal. She always plays the same sort of character in her films. One of my favorite things that they did with this film too is it is filmed in black and white. There were a few colorized versions where later on they went back and kind of colorized the black and white film and re-released it. So I grew up watching a colorized VHS version when I was a kid, but the ones that I could find online to rent on YouTube, or most of the DVDs you can find nowadays, are back to the original black and white version. So this film is in black and white, but there's a really cool feature that they used And I don't actually know if this was originally in the film or if this was something they added when they remastered it later. But whether it was original or was an innovation they added in later, it's brilliant. And that is, all of the movie takes place in this kind of cold, basic black and white, except for the scenes where they go to the New World. So when Captain Thorpe takes his crew to the Spanish colony in the New World, or in the Americas, they switch from a black and white to a sepia tone. So suddenly it's all like warm browns and white. And it really helps to convey that idea of they're in Panama for that section of the film, and it really conveys the idea of that really intense tropical heat, because there's a lot of scenes where they're out in the swamps or out in the jungle and it's very hot, and it really gives it a different feel than all the rest of the scenes that are taking place in Spain and England. And I really like how they use that simple, subtle little detail, but it really adds to the film and adds to the ambiance. So there's a lot of great things to say about this film. Like I said, it's a highly fictionalized account, but it comes from a real time period in history. I don't know if there were actual real Seahawks. I didn't do the research to find out if that was actually the case or not, but it wouldn't surprise me if there were. However, this is a really romanticized film. But it's really, really great because I love that it does give you a little bit of history, but it doesn't overwhelm you. So if you're not one of those people that cares about all the political intrigue and this king and that queen fighting in 1600 and whatever, if you're not that into that kind of stuff, there's not a ton of really important like dates and historic battles and all of those kinds of things. It's more of an adventure film, and it's more of the fictionalized fun adventure. Also, the love story in it between Donna Maria and Captain Thorpe is very minimal, so if you're hoping for a big, huge, sweeping romance, there are definitely some romantic scenes. There's definitely this undercurrent going through it, which I don't think, it's been a long time since I read the book. I was in high school last time I read the book, The Seahawk, but I don't think that there was a love story at all in the original book, if I remember correctly. I think they added that for the film. But it is a nice little love story. It's pretty minor. It's basically just there to appease the women in the audience who are like getting bored with all the fighting scenes, I think. But it's good, but it's not a major plot point. The major plot points are about the political intrigue and just the adventures on the high seas and fighting on the pirate ships and all of that. It's really, really great though. So where's our fiber arts in this movie? This is one of the ones where it's really, really brief. If you blink, you miss it. And it's actually not any knitting or crochet this time. This one is a little bit more, not something we really talk about on this channel, but it is still technically fiber arts and handcrafting, so I wanted to incorporate it. There is a scene where Queen Elizabeth is sitting with her ladies-in-waiting, and Donna Maria and the other ladies-in-waiting are singing to the queen, and they're sitting around just kind of relaxing, and all of the women are working on embroidery. So they've got like their embroidery hoops or little, I don't know what you call them. They have these cool little stands that like hold the embroidery thing, and they're like just sitting there sewing in their big floofy dresses. And so it's just embroidery this time, and unfortunately we don't get to see any close-ups of what they're actually doing. We just see like a scene of all these women sitting around sewing on these little embroidery hoops and looking very old-fashioned and regal. And that's the only reference that there really is to the fiber arts in this movie. So again, it's very, very quick, it's very brief, and it's not a major plot point at all, and it's not even technically related to knitting or crochet or spinning or any of the things we talk about on this podcast generally, but it is fiber arts. And you can embroider with yarn. And I'm not sure what they're using in the film, but I would guess that based on the time period during Elizabeth I's reign in the 1600s, I would guess it would probably be something around like maybe like some silk floss or possibly cotton, something like that. So it probably wasn't like wool yarn like we use today, but there are a lot of modern embroidery tutorials and patterns out there. And there are a lot of knitting patterns that incorporate embroidery onto something that you've knit. So you can actually knit up like a hat or a sweater or something and then use embroidery stitches and yarn to create little extra embellishments. That's something that I've only done a tiny bit of, but I really love the look of it. I'm just really impatient with the embroidery itself. I'm not very great at it. So I'm hoping to do more of that in the future. So I picked kind of a non-traditional pattern today. This film was shot in 1940. It came out in 1940, so I thought about doing like a 30s, 40s pattern, like a hat or a little sweater or something. But it's a historical film, so it's set in the 1600s. And as you will see if you watch this film, the costumes of the 1600s are very much not wearable by today's standards, and I had absolutely no interest in trying to knit something like that. So then I was left with, okay, well, would there have been anything historical that they would have used at that time that we might be able to update a little bit? I almost went with a lace mantilla, which is a Spanish, basically lace shawl. It's kind of like a rectangular or square shawl made out of lace that you would drape over like your hair or like a headdress kind of a thing, kind of like a big wrap. So I almost went with one of those, but I decided at the last minute that I was going to go with something that was very much more just like an emotional kind of, it captures the mood of part of the film. It's not historically accurate at all. It's not a vintage pattern. It's not meant to look vintage, but it is meant to look Spanish. I have an amazing book called Nikki Epstein's Knitting on Top of the World. Hopefully you can see that and there's not too much of a glare. But there's kind of a shiny cover on it, so I apologize if there's a glare. But this is an amazing book. I am sad to say I have never knit anything from this book. It's a great coffee table book with big, beautiful, glossy photos. Really interesting reading about different knitting traditions in different parts of the world. And then she'll have a few different patterns in each section. So like there's like a North America section, a South America, or maybe it's, I don't remember if it's North America and South America or just all the Americas. I think it's just the New World, so both North and South America. But there's a section for the Americas. There's a section for the Far East, so it's like Japan and China and Korea. There's a section for the Mediterranean. There's a section for like Northern Europe, and it's really, really cool. A bunch of these patterns are on my bucket list to knit someday, but I have yet to knit any of them. So today I can't show you a finished object or even a work in progress. I can only show you pictures of what I hope to knit someday. And that is the Spanish trellis scarf. Can you guys see that? Absolutely beautiful. This scarf is knit from feltable wool, and it's a worsted weight. It tells you in the pattern exactly how much you need, which we're not going to go over right now, but it's absolutely stunning. I just love how she does this kind of trellis design with her knitting with the colors. So it looks like a little green trellis up the scarf, and then she knits all of these amazing roses and leaves and felts them and attaches them to the scarf. So each end of the scarf has all these big, huge, opulent roses, felted roses and leaves. It's just stunning. It's so, so pretty. Here's another up-close picture of it. I really, really love this. I think it is so beautiful, and I would love to knit that someday. We'll see if I ever get around to it or not, but I thought it would be good for today because A, it's Spanish, and Spain is a big part of our film today. But also, if you watch the movie, there's a scene in it where Donna Maria and Captain Thorpe are trying to awkwardly tell each other their feelings, but they don't manage to get it out. And she's out gathering roses in the Queen's rose garden, and he's just had an audience with the Queen, and he's walking through the rose garden and sees her, and so he comes over to awkwardly try to talk to her, and she pricks her finger on the thorns and drops some roses, so he's gallantly helping her pick them up, and they're kind of awkwardly sort of flirting, trying to flirt, not doing well at it. And at the end of that scene, as she's standing there with all these flowers in her arms, he tells her that he'll always think of her as this statue that these nuns, I think he said in Peru, I can't remember where the statue's at, but he says somewhere in such and such convent, the nuns have a statue, and they call it My Lady of the Roses, and that's how I'll always think of you, My Lady of the Roses. And it was just a really beautiful little moment, and I kept thinking about that as I was looking through different patterns, and in the back of my head I suddenly remembered this scarf in this book and was like, oh, the rose trellis scarf would be perfect for My Lady of the Roses. So that's why I picked it. I thought it would be kind of a fun, different project, and it's so much more wearable than a lot of the more traditional patterns I was looking at. A lot of the things I was looking at for like lace mantillas, you're using like teeny tiny like embroidery floss type yarn and super tiny needles, and that can be intimidating. It can take forever, and I don't know about you, but I have to be in the right mood to knit that, whereas I thought this might be a little bit more something that a lot of us might be able to get into. Worsted weight, some felting, and just a simple scarf. So nothing super crazy or hard to do. If you've never done any felting before, I do have an old video from last year where we talked some about felting, and it's a really fun process. It's really, really cool. It's intimidating when you first do it, but then once you actually get around to it, you're like, oh, that wasn't that hard. But then you feel super accomplished. So I highly recommend you give it a try, but always, always, always swatch and then felt your swatch first, please. Do not wait until you have done all of that gorgeous knitting and then try to felt it, and just in case you ruin it. It's really hard to ruin it, by the way, don't get too freaked out, but just in case something is ruined, or even if it's not ruined, it's just a little off or it's just not the size you want, always, always, always practice on your swatch first so that you don't end up wasting all that lovely knitting and all those pretty roses that you're going to be making for this scarf. So that's all I have for you for Saturday night at the movies. I really hope that that inspires you to go watch this film. I will put a link to where you can rent it or purchase it below, and hopefully it will give you something fun to do this weekend. Also, I hope you will enjoy casting that awesome, awesome scarf on. If you don't end up casting on the scarf, but you choose another project that reminds you of the Seahawk or the time period or anything else, or Errol Flynn, please drop a comment below and let me know what pattern you would pick out to go with this film. I love finding new patterns, I love getting suggestions, and I'm really curious to see what you guys want to knit after watching this movie. So let me know what you think we should knit for this film, and I'll go check it out. I hope you guys have a great rest of your weekend. It is now time to cast off. Love you.